All right, so I have 3:30 on my clock, and since we have 90 minutes together, I want to make sure that we use our time wisely. So we have 34 participants on the call. Seems like we have a good number, still admitting folks here. I know Dr. Fenoy is on the call, and he's going to kick us off. So Dr. Fenoy, whenever you're ready, go ahead and kick us off.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see, so many friends and colleagues. This is such an important endeavor. And as we think about the realities of where we've been during COVID, and obviously we've had a strategic plan since 2016, but now is the time for us to really reimagine and think progressively of how we're going to address the needs of the students in Palm Beach County. So I just want to thank you all, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our first strategic plan steering committee, which is taking place this afternoon. A lot has happened since our strategic plan was approved by the school board back in March of 2016. Palm Beach County voters passed 2 referendums in support of our schools. I went from the district's chief operating officer to the superintendent in 2018. Later that same year, school safety and student mental health were thrust into the spotlight following the Parkland tragedy. Despite all of those challenges, we were able to repeat our A-rated school district status in 2019 due to the tireless work of all of the employees of Palm Beach County and the county at large, but more importantly, our students and teachers. And for the past year, we've had to contend with the unprecedented realities of a global pandemic that have forced us to fundamentally shift the way we approach K-12 education. With our current strategic plan sunsetting this year, I'm determined to facilitate the creation of a plan that builds on everything we've accomplished since 2016. I see this as an opportunity to refine our focus as a collective organization based on progress we've made to date, as well as lessons learned along the way. It is my firm belief that all organizations that get better are learning organizations, and they are in a perpetual state of improvement. This means that our next strategic plan is not about starting over, but refining our focus. As we begin to develop the process, I urge all of you, the members of this committee, as well as the individuals listening in today's meeting, to use this moment in time to take stock of where we are, reassess our priorities, and determine how we keep getting better for the students and families that we serve. To ensure these determinations are not made in isolation, the district has formed a steering committee composed of 37 individuals representing students, parents, community organizations, teachers, principals, regional offices, and major district divisions. Kathy will show the slide of all the people that we're including in this particular meeting. This committee will work together over the next 6 months to draft goals and associated measures for recommending as part of the district's next strategic plan. These draft goals and measures will be informed by stakeholder input collected via a survey, which launched earlier today in multiple languages and can be accessed by visiting palmbeachschools.org. And you'll see that information listed here. It is my sincere hope that each student, parent, district employee, and Palm Beach County community member takes the opportunity to complete a survey before the participation window closes in 3 weeks on Friday, April the 9th. I also appreciate members of the steering committee promoting news of the survey launch with their respective networks so that everyone knows the school district of Palm Beach County is listening. In addition to the survey, the district will organize focus groups in late May to provide stakeholders with another opportunity to provide feedback on actual goals and measures once they are drafted by the steering committee, which is this group. This is a critical step in our community engagement process, since focus group input will be used to refine goals and measures before the school board ultimately approves them in late July. I'll be reaching out to all of our community partners in early April to begin discussing meeting format options and identifying entities interested in co-hosting these events in collaboration with the district. We already have some people who have stepped up to volunteer, so I'm looking forward to getting that information out to you as well. Before they dive into today's meeting, it's important that, today's meeting and all strategic plan steering committee moving forward will be facilitated by a wonderful group and staff from the Insight Education Group. Before they dive into today's meeting agenda, I want to again reiterate my appreciation for your participation in this process and for agreeing to represent your colleagues on this committee. I look forward to seeing what we're going to accomplish together in the service of all of our students and the children and families of Palm Beach County. I want to thank you for remaining active and engaged in today's meeting and in all of our future meetings. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm very excited about it. And with that, I will turn it over to district staff for some other brief meeting reminders before we jump into our work today. Thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fenoy. So I'm going to go ahead and start recording the meeting. First meeting fail already, but I appreciate y'all working with us as we work out the kinks. But I'll go ahead and hit record here. All right, so as Dr. Fenoy said, these meetings will be recorded so that we can share them with members of the public. The meetings can also be accessed live via the district's YouTube channel. I know Dr. Fenoy sent a reminder email to our school board today with that information. It's also publicly posted on our calendar just because we want to be transparent with this process. There's also a listen-only option. All meetings, again, are recorded and will become public record and will be posted to our website. Just some other logistics in terms of remembering to keep your video on, since we know this is a large group and in the age of COVID, we can't all physically be one room, but the more we can kind of emulate that on this video chat, the better. So please keep your video on and keep yourself muted unless you're speaking, just so that we minimize background noise. We're going to use the chat box to do a few things, the first of which is capturing attendance. So for those of you who are joined, if you can just go ahead and open up the chat box feature on Google Meets and just type in your name. So I'll start that off, and that includes any support staff that is on the meeting, just so we can have a record of that. So I see folks are already doing that. So again, even if you're support staff, not necessarily a member of the steering committee, please go ahead and type your name in there. We also know that things happen. So, if you're ever late to a meeting or have to hop off, please just follow up with me so I can make sure you have all the information that you need for all subsequent meetings. As I mentioned before, we'll be using the chat box to also ask questions and provide feedback at any time. And I know Insight Education Group may ask you pointed questions. So again, please utilize that chat box as much as possible. And then if you are in need of any technical assistance during the meeting, we want to make sure that you can either reach out to myself or Ms. Lee Colbert. Our phone numbers are listed there. You'll also see in the yellow text towards the bottom that will be recurring. So even if you forget to write it down, it will still pop up on the subsequent slides. And then I think I forgot to introduce myself. So just so y'all know, my name is Kathleen Villavicencio. I'm a manager in the Chief of Staff's office, and the Chief of Staff, Mr. Ed Tierney, and myself have been tasked with supporting the work of the Strategic Plan Steering Committee as well as the development process in general. So as Dr. Fenoy said, we are extremely excited to support this most important work. I think the last thing that I will mention is based on general advice that we've received from our general counsel, this committee will be making recommendations to the superintendent related to our next strategic plan. So we just wanted to remind everybody that committee business should be discussed during committee meeting time. So please refrain from talking with other steering committee members about the strategic plan and committee business outside of these monthly meetings in accordance with Sunshine. Committee members can absolutely provide updates to their colleagues and solicit feedback as representatives from their respective stakeholder groups. So just please be mindful of those external conversations that don't occur within these monthly meetings, again, due to Sunshine. So if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Dr. Fenoy. I know he's been emailing everyone with reminders and different documents. But with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to the Insight Education Group to kick us off.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you, Dr. Fenoy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Stricker. I'm one of the co-founders of Insight Education Group. We are excited to start this process. And again, just want to reiterate our thanks for joining the steering committee and your participating in this very important work of thinking about and developing the strategic plan, which will guide the School District of Palm Beach over the next several years. Before we jump into the work, I want to just give you a bit of background. Insight is an organization that's been around for 20 years. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary. You see our vision and the impact on the screen here that we've had. But wanted to just kind of share that we're a group of former teachers, school leaders, district leaders, and state department folks as well. And I share that because what's important about I think the lens that we bring is that it's a lens of implementation. So at the end of the day, when we think about this strategic plan and how it will be implemented, we want to think about how doable it is, as well as how aspirational it is. And we have experienced that firsthand as former teachers, school leaders, and district leaders, kind of on both sides of the coin. Those who are developing a strategic plan with steering committees as district leaders, and those who are charged with really implementing it as former CAOs, school principals who are the most important on the ground, along with teachers. And so that implementation lens is really critical, not only for us to be transparent about that with you all, but also for this committee, I think, in order to help us kind of balance the aspirational with the sort of how we can implement this with the boots on the ground. On the next slide, we'll share just a few comments about the work that we do. We work with districts to do strategic planning across the country. We do leadership development support, kind of school improvement writ large, and teacher growth. And the reason I share all of those things with you is because we don't see one isolated sort of silo as the only work that's important, but rather it's important to kind of connect the dots and to understand how the goals that we're developing in this strategic plan will impact school leaders and their ability to actually move that work, to train their teachers, how the goals in the strategic plan align to school improvement plans, how they align to teacher professional development. So that systems alignment is really critical, and our work with our partners across the country touches each of those aspects. And so we have sort of a firsthand understanding of the importance of that alignment and the importance of congruity, but also what happens if those things get out of alignment. And so we'll try to push the committee in that regard as well, to think through those lenses also. On the next slide, I want to just share our focus for today. So that's a little bit about us. And by the way, with me today from Insight, I have Kate England, who's been with Insight for a number of years. Prior to joining Insight, she was the Chief Academic Officer of Hartford Public Schools. We also have Brian Pick, who is with us, and he most recently was with he was the Chief Academic Officer in DC Public Schools. And so we're very happy to have both of them. They will be supporting the work throughout the steering committee process as well, as part of the Insight team. Our focus for today is pretty simple. We want to just ensure that everyone has a common understanding of the process and timeline for the completion of the plan. We want to calibrate a little bit on the steering committee's role so that we can work effectively together. We also want to calibrate on the purpose of a strategic plan and walk away with a common understanding today of what a plan is, but also what a plan is not. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And then our final goal or objective for today is to identify from you all what you like about the structure of various plans from across the country, as well as the content. And we'll use that information to start to shape the draft of the structure of this plan. We'll use the content affinities that you surfaced today to help us understand what good goals look like in relation to the context for the school district of Palm Beach. But all of that will be really helpful as we move forward and hopefully accelerate our progress so that we're clear on roles, we're clear on what a strategic plan does, and we're clear on what we like and don't like in terms of strategic plans. And so today is about engaging you in those three things. And with that, I want to go on to our meeting norms and talk a little bit about how we can get the most out of these meetings. So these norms are not just about this meeting, but about each of our meetings together. And that first one is about engaging. And so to accomplish those things I just talked about, the value of this steering committee comes from the conversation and the ability to sort of not only calibrate, but to share thoughts and opinions and represent your stakeholder group and to push each other. And that can only happen if we engage. And so I gave some examples of what that might look like just now when I was talking about engage. If you have other examples of what you think effective engagement would look like, please feel free to put those in the chat. This is your first opportunity as we go through these norms to say, I think effective engagement looks like this. We recognize that many of you have been through steering committee processes for either strategic plans or other important planning processes with the school district, with your own organizations outside of the school district. And we want to capture that value. And so we want to hear from you around what is most important and effective from your experience around engaging in these processes. So take a minute as I move on to number 2. And if you have thoughts on what effective engagement could look like, please feel free to put those in the chat. The next one, seek to understand others' views. I sort of alluded to this, but as you saw from the steering committee membership, there's a cross section of stakeholders that are represented here and that bring tremendous value. And so in addition to engaging, trying to think about another person's point of view so that we can be as representative as possible in this strategic plan is going to be critical. So things like asking clarifying questions of others as we move through, seeking to sort of maybe listen a little bit to others and challenge our own assumptions about goals, about initiatives and priorities for the district. Those are all aspects of meeting norms and number 2, the seeking to understand others' views that are going to be important for our work. The next one, and again, please feel free to start putting information in the chat. We're capturing this chat. And so Melinda, thank you. You sort of kicked us off around thinking that effective engagement looks like considering all stakeholders in our responses, waiting for others to speak first. Thank you for that. Much appreciated. We're capturing this chat though so that we can look at it, analyze it between meetings, and make sure that we make course corrections around the engagement strategies we use with you all to ensure that we're capturing as much of your agency and voice as possible. Think short-term and long-term is number 3. And so this one is about thinking about those aspirational goals for the school district. In 5 years from now, what do we hope the district will achieve? What do we hope for our students, our young people throughout the county? What do we want them to be able to know and be able to do and feel, quite frankly, as they go through this system? That, though, as we backward map it, has to be grounded in some short-term goals. What does that look like this year, next year, the year after that? And so that's what we mean by think short-term and long-term. It's a balance of both the aspirational as well as sort of the practical this year, what we can accomplish. To preview what that's going to look like, when we get to goal setting a few meetings from now, you're going to probably hear us push around how aggressively we can move towards a set of goals, whether they be reading achievement, math achievement, graduation rates, whatever those goals are. You'll hear us push to achieve that balance between the aspirational as well as the realistic in relation to what we can accomplish. In our experience, strategic plans that are most effective are implemented and used and looked at frequently, but they also experience short wins. Organizations experience these wins along the way. And so you'll hear us sort of frame these goals through that perspective. I see some other things coming through in terms of effective engagement, giving feedback when needed, committee members and the community giving input is valued and incorporated into the development, execution, and assessment and reassessment of this plan. Absolutely. So finally, use an equity lens. There's some parallel work that's happening in the district to really understand, unpack, and define equity. And to ensure that we are not exacerbating any inequities that may exist, and that we're doing all that we can to mitigate those. And so to define what equity is some parallel work that's happening. We are connecting to that work as we plan for these meetings, but we're also going to incorporate this concept of developing an equity sort of definition and think about the root causes of inequities in the county. And so you'll experience that next meeting as we look at data. You'll see us look at what is the data telling us? What do we think the root causes of inequity are? And as we bring those two things together, how are those informing the goals as we move forward? So those are our meeting norms. They're sort of broad, but really important as we dig into them. I want to stop for a minute and give you a moment. If there are other things you want to put in the chat, please do so. If you have some thoughts on any of these that you'd like to share with the committee, please unmute yourself and we'd welcome your thoughts.
Flora Feldman. I have a question. Will this process include an overview of the progress made on the last strategic plan?
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that question. Just to clarify, the question was, will this process include an update on where we are with our last strategic plan? What progress have we made? When we start to look at data, we'll unpack that progress. And in the surveys that we're sending out to folks, we're asking about that progress as well. And so the short answer is yes, we'll do that in multiple ways. Any other feedback on these meeting norms or questions related to them?
Yes, my name is Chuck Wrigley. When you use the word equity, are you only talking in terms of academic performance, or do you mean equity in the way staff is interfaced with, as well as equity in terms of the way the district does business?
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate that. We mean all of the above. It's how we interact with one another, the expectations that we have for each other, for our students, as you mentioned, and to really understand as an organization what equity means beyond just student achievement, but about access to opportunities that are provided to students that lead to achievement, how we think about those as adults, and how we treat each other, because that's a model for how we set up the systems and policies in our school district as well, to create an equitable system. And so all of the above is the short answer, Chuck. Thank you for that.
If I could add, Chuck, just a clarifying question. In the strategic planning, Chuck, were you also referring to sort of the business side of the district as well in terms of equity?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that is a key point, and it'll be interesting over time how the sort of operational features in terms of purchasing, procurement, all of those things can be applied and applicable within this particular document.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions on meeting norms before we move on? All right, let's move to the next slide. We're going to dig into just a little bit more on the timeline. So the school board is working on completing, as I just mentioned, some of that foundational equity work. So they've been engaged in that throughout this month. They'll continue that in April. We will tie into that during our next meeting and do some of the same sort of thinking and processes that the school board has done so that we can calibrate on our own understanding of equity and really understand it ourselves. We are on that second line, a monthly steering committee meeting. So this group will meet monthly starting today, moving through August. That last meeting we're going to hold, which is why it's a different color, for a celebration. It may be more of a celebratory meeting than a working meeting, but we'll see how much work we get accomplished until then. There's an internal needs assessment that has been ongoing along with the first phase 1 engagement survey. So those next two lines working in tandem. And I'll talk a little bit more about the two phases of engagement. Kathy mentioned them earlier, but I'll reiterate those. Phase 1 of engagement, again, is that survey that launches today, closes April 9th, and is a survey that goes out to a broad group of stakeholders throughout the county asking for their feedback. So we'll take a look at the results from that survey during our next meeting. The next line, the school board, we hope to get a draft set of goals to the school board as well as associated measures. There's a tentative meeting for May 19th where the school board can look at those, give us feedback, and then we can make some adjustments based on the feedback from the board. Along with the board's feedback, we'll be getting feedback from focus groups. So once the draft goals have been developed, we'll also be going out into the community and asking via focus groups for very specific feedback on the actual goals. Can different stakeholders see themselves in the goals? Do they understand the goals? Are they applicable? Are they the most important ones from their perspective? That'll happen in May and June. All of that will help us make some final revisions during the June and July steering committee so that we can take a set of recommendations to the school board on goals and associated measures in July. And that's that last line, what that last timeline, when that last line on the timeline emphasizes. So that's our work between now and July. It's an aggressive timeline, but not at all undoable. It keeps us in a pace where our heads stay engaged in the work. So there's not too much time that has passed where we start to forget what we talked about during the last meeting. And just to be transparent, those were some of the decisions that we made as we mapped out this timeline so that we could be efficient with our time, be respectful of your time, but also ensure that we were connecting the dots from one month to the next and from one sort of piece of feedback to another. So that's the timeline. Next slide, please. Just to reiterate some of the engagement processes. So the steering committee is this group made up of you all, the cross-section of stakeholders we talked about. In addition to your feedback and co-development of these goals, we're getting feedback from the community through this phase 1 engagement that we've already talked about, which will inform the goals. We'll take those draft goals once they've been developed to get feedback from the board as well as through focus groups from throughout the community. That'll help us then provide a second set of recommendations to Dr. Fenoy, who can provide those recommendations to the school board. And then after those goals are approved, what you see on the right-hand side where it says key performance indicators. So what happens after these goals are developed? The goals then will be used by divisions, departments, and school-based personnel to start to create aligned KPIs. What does this mean for the human resource department when we have a set of goals? For the finance department, for academics, for each of our schools, for the regional superintendents leading each of these school efforts. So those KPIs are be very specific and will be developed and aligned to the draft goals by divisions, departments, and school-based personnel. Want to move on to, that's the broad framework, and let's start to get into the work of a steering committee. Wanted to just take a moment to kind of calibrate on what's the value of a steering committee. We've alluded to it and talked explicitly a little bit about the value of having a steering committee, but I'd like to hear from you all. So I'm going to stop and just ask some feedback. What do you all see as the value of this steering committee? And then we'll talk about specifically our role in relation to your responses. So I'll open it up to the group. In the chat window, please feel free to place some responses to what you see as the value of a steering committee. If you'd like to unmute yourself and share with the group, please do so.
Hello, my name is Monique McTeer. I think the value of the steering committee is to provide insight and opportunity to understand a broader perspective of students that we service and the needs that they have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Monique. Much appreciated. We're seeing some similar comments come through in the chat around getting diverse voices, independent and multiple perspectives, feedback. Other thoughts? Does anyone else want to unmute and share what they think the value of a steering committee is?
Hi, this is Lisa Williams-Taylor. I would just add that it takes all of us working together to help support our children, so you really get buy-in if everyone's taking a part in creating this plan together.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lisa.
I also think that we all come from different, not just multiple perspectives, but we have different networks of people that we also get input from, so we can all reach out in a different way to bring back that input.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jamie.
It also gives us some sort of cadence of accountability. By having a steering committee that has a regular meeting schedule, then whatever objectives or goals or items we have to bring back, we now are accountable to the committee to do that work.
Thanks, Dr. Fenoy. Cindy, I think you had a comment as well.
Yeah, I think it's very empowering for different stakeholders, and it gives us that buy-in. So the plan is developed not just from the superintendent or from an outside company. It's coming from the perspective of needs of various stakeholders. And for me as a classroom teacher, it helps me to understand that these plans are not just produced, they're created based on what we as a district need. So it kind of empowers us to use them in meaningful ways.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy, very much. Any other thoughts on the value of a steering committee? If we could go to the next part of this slide, much of what you just voiced is sort of what we see as the value of the steering committee as well, but wanted to just calibrate on this to make sure we're all on the same page. So obviously this committee is co-creating the plan, specifically the goals that live within the plan. Many of you referenced the need to ensure that we have as much inclusiveness, diversity of perspectives. That's what this next one is getting at, elevating the voice of stakeholders. There's a few different ways to develop strategic plans. It could happen sort of, in an office by someone, a leader or different leaders of the organization that then push the plan out. This is not that process. This process is very different. It's about engaging a collective voice, raising that collective voice, finding commonality that we can then codify into the goals of a strategic plan. That helps us do a lot of things, not the least of which is have some ownership of the plan, see ourselves in the plan, and be more likely to support the implementation of that plan from whatever seat we sit in. The next one was talked about, I think, by Jamie, being ambassadors for this process. I think Jamie used the words that sort of a network, and we have the ability to, share not only the plan itself, but to share the process and to say, hey, here's kind of what happened. I'm excited about serving on this steering committee. Of course, I want to reiterate the importance of doing the steering committee's work in this committee itself. But, once the plan is baked and being able to share those goals with a broader base of group of individuals can certainly be supportive of the implementation and success of achieving our goals. And then finally, providing thought leadership on implementation of the plan. So it's not just about getting a plan developed, but about thinking together around how we can best use the plan after it's approved by the board. And so ensuring that we are able to do a good job of sort of thinking forward and thinking about what does it mean to have these goals in place from my perspective as a community organization leader, as a student, as a principal, as a parent. How can I actually best engage in order to get the most out of the plan itself? Kathy we have some student reps on the call. Thank you, students, for joining us. It's so important to have your voice. You are those that we serve. And so your voices are valued and welcome, so feel free to. I know it can be intimidating with a bunch of adults on a call like this, but please feel free to share your thoughts as well. They are more than welcome. Next slide, please. Let's take this a little step further and talk about what a strategic plan is and is not. We talked just for a moment about the value of a steering committee in the development of a plan, but in this first meeting, it's important also to calibrate on what a plan is and isn't. Let's talk first about what you think a strategic plan is. We'll use the same process, so please feel free to put in the chat window what you think a strategic plan is, and or unmute yourself and share with us from your perspective what a strategic plan is. We're just going to focus on that green check mark, what it is, for a moment. Some of you have used the word vision already. We often hear blueprint as another. There we go. Jamie, thank you. Roadmap. A roadmap to successful outcomes. So it gives us sort of a guide. James, same thing, roadmap. Julia typing in organization of priorities in an outlined format. Yeah, that's really important, that the strategic plan has to be accessible. When we get to calibrating on the structure of plans in just a few minutes, you'll see some plans that are quite long. And we'll talk about how those details are sometimes helpful, but sometimes distracting in terms of allowing us to really engage in the plan itself. It's a living document, absolutely, that can and should be updated as circumstances change. Yeah, the question that we often hear is, how do we know when a change is an improvement? And if that change that we're proposing from a strategy perspective isn't leading to improvement, can we allow ourselves the ability to make a course correction? In that way, it's a fluid document. It gives direction, but it's not prescriptive necessarily, right? So where the implementation of the plan is about sort of using the plan directionally, but not making changes where we see changes have to be necessarily made. What that means is we're not probably going to undo the vision and the mission and core values of the organization or necessarily the goals, But how we achieve those goals probably will change over time as we learn new information about what's working and what's not working.
I would just add on that last point about the vision and the goals. I think it's important for the committee to know that the board is working through that process now. So we will not be adjusting goals and mission and vision, but the board is going through that process as we speak, specifically as it relates to making equity a focus of our strategic plan in our district.
Thanks, Dr. Fenoy. What is a strategic plan not? So this is the opposite of what it is. It is not ... And how would you fill in the blank? An ironclad contract. It is not prescriptive. Thank you. Not a crystal ball. Yeah, we do our best based on what we know at the time in terms of predicting where we want to go. This year, if nothing else, has taught us how quickly that can change in a COVID environment. We often also hear that a strategic plan is not a work plan. So it is not intended to be everyone's, including principals, central office staff, community leaders who are partnering with the district. It is not their monthly to-do list of how we can get through. So that's an important calibration point because it helps us understand the length of this document, what's included and what's not. So when we get to the point of approving goals, those goals have to be accessible, they have to be understandable by everyone, but they're not intended to be everyone's sort of work plan that sets out month by month, here's what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. Not the solution to how to meet all challenges and realize opportunities, for sure. They provide guidance and direction, and that's what the definition that we're showing in the bottom of this slide is talking about. This definition comes from a recent blog from Harvard Business Review. And a couple of things that I want to point out here is the word ongoing. So some of you elevated that concept that to implement, we have to pay attention to the plan and not put it on a shelf once it's done or approved. We have to be nimble with the plan. So it's an ongoing living document. It helps us prioritize effort and allocate resources. One of the things that came up earlier that Dr. Fenoy talked about is that the board will use the plan after it's approved to effectively allocate resources and to think about how we actually align policy and our spending to the goals so that we can most effectively achieve those goals. And then lastly, what I want to point out in this definition is alignment, the term align. So the strategic plan, once we complete this process, we hope that this steering committee will have some common understanding around direction of the district, as well as the board and other stakeholders as they've been engaged. But we know the work doesn't stop there. We have to keep sharing the plan, communicating it, talking about the plan itself in order to have continuous alignment. Without that alignment in an organization as large as your school district, but also, quite frankly, in small organizations, we could inadvertently be pulling against each other and working towards different outcomes if we're not communicating about the goals and how we're working towards achieve those goals. So that alignment of stakeholders is really important. With that, I want to move on just to, as that has kind of set the stage, to just share a few other statistics. This percentage, 85%, it represents, as we click through the next click, 85% is the percent of leadership teams that spend less than 1 hour a month on strategy. So based on that definition that we just sort of co-constructed and looked at together, if we're spending less than 1 hour a month on strategy, it's going to be really hard to think about how we stay aligned, how we continue to allocate and reallocate resources. Let's look at the next statistic. 50%, and that represents the percent of leadership teams that spend no time at all on strategy. And by the way, these come from that same study and research that Harvard Business Review did, not just on school districts and education organizations, but on organizations across sectors, healthcare, nonprofit, business, NGOs, so all those sectors. But it's startling when we look at sort of the summary of these percentages of how much time is actually spent on looking at strategy and what that means in terms of our ability to be effective. Let's look at the next statistic. There's two more. 95%, and that represents the percentage of employees that don't understand an organization's strategy. So the work of the strategic plan starts here but doesn't end here. And again, Jamie's comment about our ability to employ our networks is really critical. If not all the employees understand the organization's strategy, it's hard for them to move in the direction of that strategy. If our community partners don't understand the strategy, it's hard for them to move in the direction and link arms with them around that strategy. And so this steering committee and this process was formed so that we can set the foundation for that common understanding and alignment, and then continue that work beyond the development of the plan itself. The last statistic is just what that means. 90% of organizations is the percentage of organizations that fail to meet their strategic targets, which shouldn't be shocking if we look at the amount of time generally that we see spent on strategic plans or strategy or engaging employees in understanding the strategy. That 90% figure should not come as a shock. So we want to avoid all of that. We want to do the opposite of that and start to mitigate these percentages and hopefully lower these incident rates. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to now get into the so here's what we've done up to this point, just to recalibrate. We've outlined the process. We've outlined the role of the steering committee. We've talked about the timeline and specific dates and the way in which other stakeholders will be engaged. And we've calibrated on the importance of strategic planning itself, what it is and what it's not. Please feel free to, if there are other resources that you have to share, to place them in the chat, other comments. So I'm continuing to monitor the chat and see some other folks who have talked about reading that article, referring to kind of CEOs too, who spend less time on strategy. So it's important that from the top down, we're spending as much time on strategy as possible. So we've done all of those things so far. We want to now get into sort of calibrating on what you like and don't like about various plans so that we can pay attention to that as we start to co-create the plan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate England, who is going to walk you through one example. This is from Jackson Public Schools. And as she walks you through this one example, I want you to think about a few things. What you like about the layout of this plan, and you can make notes either in the chat box. Please feel free to add those notes. What you like about the content, and what aspects of layout and content should we try to replicate? What aspects of layout and content should we try to avoid? So this is a very concrete way for us to just get into your heads a little bit as a steering committee and to understand from your perspective what works and what doesn't work about the design of a plan, both structurally and from a content perspective. This conversation is also going to be a model for what we're going to ask you to do in just a moment, which is to take a look at a couple of different plans, different from the Jackson Public Schools plan, and give us some feedback. What do you like? What do you don't like around the layout and the content of those plans? We'll give you some explicit directions around that process, but first we want to model that process for you via the Jackson Public Schools plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate England.
Jason, before you go, Mrs. Baker had her hand up, if you don't mind.
Oh, yes, please. Sorry, I missed it. Please jump in. Ms. Baker.
Maybe she changed her mind. We'll come back to her.
Yeah, please interrupt us, stop us. We want to be sure that your questions are answered. And if you have a comment that you want to make, please feel free to make that. Kate, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Jason indicated, we're going to start digging into the actual work of this afternoon and looking at some strategic plans. And I'm really happy that Jason brought this up. We're definitely trying to avoid the statistics on that slide that indicated that nobody's using this strategic plan. And layout and format really has a lot to do with that. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is you were emailed a copy of the Jackson Public Schools plan. So if you can just take a moment to locate that attachment, that will be really helpful as we start to walk through the plan. While you're locating that, I want to norm us on the vocabulary of layout and content. So when we're talking about the layout, we're really talking about how the document looks. Is the length about right? How do you like the design? Is the amount of text right on the pages? How do you feel about the organization? And as Jason said, definitely popping comments as we go through into the chat will be great. The other key area is the content, and that's the actual subject matter of the plan. So the things that are included in the plan, Dr. Fenoy indicated that your board will be working on the mission and vision, but in Jackson's plan, you'll be seeing some core values, you'll be looking at some of their key priorities. So thinking about how that content really resonates with you. And then ultimately, as Jason indicated, we're going to figure out what we want to keep for the school district of Palm Beach, and then what we kind of want to think about not having in our plan. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, just to turn to the title page, which is the first thing you're going to look at. And, you know, lots of times we don't think about the importance of a title, but titles are extremely important. So as you look at Jackson's, I would note that it's succinct. It is called Excellence for All, and it signals that the district is focusing, on excellence, but not just for certain populations of students, but for everybody in the district. So just thinking about the title, the succinctness of it, and how that sends a message for the district's work. If you move on to the next page of the plan, we've already talked about the vision and the mission briefly in terms of who's going to be organizing that for the district, but it's important to note that pretty much every strategic plan I've seen has a vision and a mission, and they indicate sort of the far-reaching ideas and aspirational pieces for the students in your district, but they also, in a succinct way, speak to how that's going to happen. And the details become more evident as you go more fully into a plan. So taking a look at page 1, many plans now include core values, and I just want to take a moment to pause and speak about Jackson's specifically and in terms of their work in the district. So I work quite a bit in the Jackson Public Schools, along with having helped them with their strategic plan. And I've been so impressed with their ability to take their 6 core values and to weave them into all aspects of the work that they do. They start most of their meetings with their core values. They're part of their performance evaluation system for their central office leader includes the core values. So, you know, thinking about not only how we develop our plan, but its utility for all the people that work in the district as well as for our students. So I'm going to pause right here and ask you to pop in the chat. So far, in looking at the few pages that we've looked at, is anything jumping out at you in terms of what you really like about this, or what you notice in terms of the text amount or some of the graphics and things that you may not like? And I'll keep rolling, but if anything's occurring to you right off the bat, just feel free to pop that in the chat. So if you move on to the next few pages, these are simply an overview of the district and some of the challenges and opportunities that the district has faced in the recent past. And then finally, how they developed their plan. So when we think about the number of people that are in this room, and it's quite impressive, we also know that we have many stakeholders that were not able to join our steering committee. So we want to make sure that we're as transparent as possible in speaking about how we are creating this plan, and potentially if that's populated in the plan someplace. So I'm looking at the chat box, and I see Dr. Fenoy has noted that equity comes first in their core values. Absolutely. The order of the core values seems to have caught people's attention, I believe, as a positive. And then Diana Fetterman sharing that by placing equity as the first value, it's an important statement. So certainly with the lens of work that you're doing around equity with your Board of Education, I think those are really key points to consider as we move forward. And I appreciate Sharman noting that the fonts are the same for the most part. So, keeping that kind of crisp text layout helps the reader focus more on the content of the plan as opposed to on some of the details like the text. So moving along, if you move on to page 7, you will notice our first table in the plan. So I would put that under the layout section. And I'm trying so hard not to bias anybody right now. I definitely have my feelings about plans, and having sort of clear graphics is one of them. So I gave you a mini bias. But this is Jackson's, the way they speak about their measurable goals, and they call them milestones. So if you look down the left-hand side, you'll see where they want their scholars, as they call them in their plan, to be by 2024. And what I draw your attention to is they have goals. Now, I want to point out, first of all, that Jackson was not anymore. Fortunately, they're making some great progress, but they were a poor performing district. They were F-rated for several years when we started working there. And so, when you take a look at their metrics, you'll see that they have some work to do around getting their students to proficiency. But what I really appreciate is they set goals that were aspirational, but they were also attainable. And as we move into our measurable goals discussion, next month. Those are the kinds of things we'll be talking about. But what's most important to look at here right now is how they have this organized. So they talk about what their goal is, or their milestone as they call it. They note where they want to be across their 5-year plan. They note where they are now, and then they have some specific items that speak to how they're going to measure their progress. So for the most part, those items on the right-hand side are things like their state test or the national tests that we use. But sometimes if you look at the first example, their first milestone is around all of their scholars having access rather to a high-quality JPS pre-kindergarten experience. They're a district of roughly about 20,000 students at this point. And when we started the strategic plan, they only had 580 seats available. So they really have been very intentional about building those out now and then across their 5 years so that every student has that opportunity. And rather than having a test, obviously, they're measuring that by number of seats. So, we'll get way more into goals later, so I don't want to belabor that now. But I'd pause here too and now ask, what are your feelings about the table they have here? How understandable are their goals and the associated measurements? And I'm seeing that while we're waiting, Mrs. Baker is indicating she raised her hand in error, so I think that makes us feel better about not disregarding what she might have had to say. But as Jason said, please feel free to unmute if you have something that you'd like to chime in. All right, so I'm going to move along to what I would consider the meat of the plan. And Jackson Public Schools calls these their commitments. And they're saying that these are their really important priorities. What we know about strategic plans is we can't have a lot of these. So, in thinking about the length of a plan, and thinking about that startling statistic slide that Jason had up earlier about the fact that many places don't understand what their organization's plan is, I think it's really important that we think about the right number of commitments, as they call them, or key priorities, or whatever districts choose to call them as we go forward. So I'm going to walk you through some specific aspects of one of these commitments. So I'd like you to turn to page 9 so we can look at innovative teaching and learning. And while you're getting there, we have a little bit of feedback on the milestone chart. I appreciate that. Victoria says that she appreciates the chart to clearly outline the goals and where they're starting, and it also shows how much work is left to achieve that goal, right? So it helps us manage the expectations of folks too. If we're at a very low level of proficiency in reading, for example, we're not going to get there overnight. Warren Eldridge is asking, was the plan developed with community input? It certainly was. Prior to helping the district with their strategic plan, we worked with them for a year to embark on a very massive data gathering and community feedback session pertaining to where they were in the state of their district. And we developed a really comprehensive report based on all that information, and all that feedback was used to then generate their strategic plan. As we developed the strategic plan in Jackson, we then ran several community focus meetings that allowed us to get input as we were going along in specific aspects of the plan. So we feel like we did a pretty good job there, but certainly feel free to ask them as well, because I'm sure they would be happy to chime in about that. And then Terrence Dwyer saying the criteria for where we are now doesn't seem on surface to align well metric-wise with how do we measure progress. So that's a great observation. So making sure that we're aligning our current state with where we're trying to go, and then how we're measuring that, and maybe explaining it more clearly for stakeholders would be helpful. So I appreciate that feedback, Terrence. So moving on to commitment number 2, innovative teaching and learning. I just want to take a moment to talk about the flow of this page. And specifically, you'll notice that there are commitments around, obviously, as it states, innovative teaching and learning, and then they've put forth a paragraph or two for each one of the commitments around exactly what that means. So a lot of this can be open to interpretation, right? My innovation is not your innovation. I happen to be looking at Cindy right now. It's not her innovation. So we would all have some different ideas about that likely. So the more clear we can be in our description of what we're talking about when we're talking about priorities or commitments in this example, the better off all of us are going to be, and the better off all of our colleagues, principals, teachers, central office folks who have to implement this plan are going to be, so that we have a normed definition of what we're talking about. Importantly as well is laying out, and you'll notice here Jackson calls these commitments and actions, and they call them their initiatives. So not only are we saying we're going to have this commitment or this priority, we're talking about what it is, what it looks like, but we're also talking about some succinct steps that talk about how to get there. So in Jackson's example, you see, if we're talking about teaching and learning, this was a district that didn't have consistent or coherent curriculum. So obviously that was going to be very important. Not only did they not have it in one subject area or content area, they didn't have it in many areas. So that had to be one of their key initiatives moving forward. So I don't need to read the list to you, obviously, but just to get the flavor of the kinds of things that they built out for each one of their commitments around what they felt would get them where they wanted to be across the 5 years. And then finally, if you look at the bottom of the page, you'll note an implementation plan. And they developed this for several reasons, and I've seen this in many district strategic plans as well. And I think it's a really, here I go with my biases again, I think it's a really clever idea because it does a couple of things. It helps us build out across a number of years what we're going to be doing. If you look at the fact that Jackson has 5 commitments, each has several initiatives, and they have such important work to do as you do in the District of Palm Beach County, it's not possible to get all this important work done in 1 year. So this helps us as the leaders in the district and as the folks who have to carry out the plan, understand what the expectation is for year 1 of the plan. Are we planning this year? Are we implementing this year? Are we in continuous improvement or continuous refinement? I can't think who right now, but somebody said something to the effect of, you know, we need to keep looking back into the plan even after it's developed. And this allows us to do that. This allows us to understand, you know, did we overshoot where we thought we were going to be? I can speak in the case of Jackson to the fact that they undershot beautifully for their preschool work. They have many seats available to students right now, many more than they thought they would in the 2nd year of their plan. So, you know, thinking about those things as we go across the number of years and thinking about what's actually feasible. And the last thing I'd say about that is not only does it help you manage your work within the district, it also really helps you manage the expectations of everybody who will be watching to see how you're moving forward in the implementation of your plan, to understand that it's not feasible to do everything in your 1st year. So again, I'll pause there and I'm going to monitor the chat for a moment, and I'm also going to give you an opportunity to respond to the flow on this page around the commitment or what might be called priorities, the initiatives that are associated, and then the implementation plan. So Terrence Dwyer is asking how we articulate or factor in the responsibility of administrators to support the innovation of teachers in the classroom in order for the collective effort to be successful. That's a great question. And Jason alluded to this a little bit earlier, but the way we think about this is that, you know, the strategic plan is the umbrella for the district, and it really outlines at a high level how we're going to chart the course for success and continued improvement. What happens from there is each department develops its own plan, operating plans. Each school develops its own strategic improvement plan. And from there, administrators are able to help teachers really better understand the intent of the plan across all the areas that the district's trying to improve. Hopefully that answered your question, Terrence. If not, feel free to pop back in there. And I'm going to close my walkthrough of the plan just by drawing your attention to the final page, which is page 13. And this is the profile of a JPS graduate. And many districts also choose to put this in their plan as a way to explain their aspirations for graduates and what they might be able to succeed with in the future. So just a really high level overview of the things that are really, really important in this example: digital literacy, critical thinking, and collaboration and citizenship. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to think overall with the Jackson Public Schools plan. We've gone through really quickly. You're going to get a chance to go into your own plans in a moment. But if you could pop in chat or unmute and share, I'd love to hear your voices and see your faces as well. What really resonated with you about the overall layout of the plan entirely? I know we did certain aspects of it, but in the entirety, what resonated with you in terms of layout, content, and then specifically for the school district of Palm Beach County, what would you think would be something we'd want to hold on to, or something that we'd want to say, there's no way we're doing this? So Thomas Hogarth notices that not all initiatives are measurable. So I'm going to take a leap of inference and say that you think that all of our initiatives need to be measurable and tied to those specific metrics. Melinda is saying that the layout is concise and consistent, and she appreciates that. Thank you for that. Easy for any reader to follow and concrete. Warren Eldridge, yes, loved that the targeted outcomes could be stated on one page. Very helpful for all of us. Victoria Young is chiming in saying the timeline creates accountability for each initiative, really important. Also one of their core values, accountability and excellence. Natasha Bell, simple and clean layout, length of the plan, great. Is there anything, oh, excuse me.
This is Donald Fennoy.
Hi.
So on the commitments and the key initiatives, now, was I clear when I heard you, is this Jackson's first strategic plan, or is this a continuation of an existing strategic plan?
That's a great question, thanks. This is their first strategic plan.
All right, so the reason I asked that specifically, in our current existing strategic plan, one of the challenges we had was having 19 initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
It became completely unwielding. And so part of what I hope to envision for this next one is much clearer and not as many. We go deeper on a smaller group of initiatives, ideally. But it was, as I read it, I was like, oh, they got a lot of work to do. And it's over time, living it in Palm Beach and in other districts, the more you have, the more you kind of get spread out.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate that, Dr. Fennoy, and I think that's great feedback. And I agree with you as I'm walking through this for the umpteenth time now. There are a lot of initiatives that are listed under their commitments, but I will say that they've been very intentional about sticking with their implementation plan, and that's really helped them a lot, not only just for their own peace of mind, but also for helping everybody in the community understand that it's going to take a minute for them to be able to carry all this off. But 19 initiatives, in my humble opinion, is a lot. So I would love to see us be able to trim down what we say we're going to do as we continue to move forward with the plan in your district as well. And lots of...
I love the word commitment versus goal. It's something about a commitment is more intimate to me and more personal. I like that language.
I love that too. Thanks for bringing that up. I can't say it any better than you did. It just makes it seem also, I think, so much more collective, right? We're all committing to this together. And it's been very powerful there as well. So it's amazing, very, very related to this conversation, how nuances of vocabulary can make a really big difference when we're doing something as important as strategic planning. All right, so I know we are crunched on time and there's such great stuff in the chat. So I'm going to discipline myself and not dig in there, but I want to thank you all so much for your participation and your communication during this portion of the presentation. I'm going to kick it back over to Jason to allow us to go on to the next step of our presentation.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone, for your good feedback. I really appreciate it. We're going to give you an opportunity now to dig into a few other strategic plans. So Jackson is just one of many plans. Plans exist in many school districts across the country. We want an opportunity to kind of look at a variety of plans and ask ourselves, what do we like? What do we dislike? Just in the same way that we did with the Jackson plan. So here's how we're going to do it. 3 steps. Each person has an assigned plan that you'll look at first. And for that assigned plan, you're going to record what you like and don't like about the layout and the content. It's that simple. Where you record is on a Jamboard. So for those of you that have used Jamboard, probably a lot of the teachers on this call have used Jamboard in their classrooms. A Jamboard is simply virtual chart paper. That's the simple way to describe it. And so we're going to put a link in the chat box right now. When you click on that link, you'll see the virtual chart pad come up. And for each, there's one piece of chart paper for each plan. And so you can scroll across the top to see which plan is your assigned plan and provide feedback. You are also going to provide feedback via sticky notes. So what you like and dislike. And I'm wondering if Lee or Kathy, if you could actually project the Jamboard really quickly so that I can walk folks through what that looks like. So it's fairly simple. For each plan, you'll see on the Jamboard when it comes up. If you were assigned Alexandria City Public Schools, you'll see the title at the top. You'll see the graphic of the plan right in the middle. On the left-hand side, layout. On the right-hand side, content. You're going to provide what you like and don't like about layout and content. Likes are going to go on green Post-it notes. Dislikes on pink Post-it notes. The Post-it notes are what you see right in the middle of that screen where you click. It'll open up an actual sticky note, you type right in there, you select your color. We're doing it again. Here's a red example, dislikes. And once you save, you can just click cancel or click out of that box, and then you can move your sticky note around as well. So if you got it in the wrong place, you can move it, etc. So it's fairly simple. We're going to give you about 10 minutes to go through this process and just kind of quietly walk through your assigned plan. If you finish one plan, please feel free to go into another plan, and we'll put a link in the chat box as well that gives you a link to, I think, about 7 or 8 different plans. So, and on the next slide, we'll show you the number of plans. Here they are. And these are your assignments as well. You also received an email with your assignment today and a link directly to your assigned plan. But you can see that we have folks in group 1. If you're in group 1, you're looking at Alexandria City Public Schools, group 2, Boston, group 3, Chicago Public Schools, group 4, DC, group 5, Guilford County, group 6, Miami-Dade, and group 7, Waukee School District. These plans represent a range of size of school district, demographics, geographically across the country, and just diversity in terms of the plan itself as well. Some are short, some are long, some have commitment, some have goal. And so it gives you a good window into a variety of ways to start to structure these plans. We'll then look at some of your feedback for the last few minutes of this call and start to think about what you like and dislike as a whole group, and then we'll wrap up the meeting. So that's where we're going next. Your next step is to spend a few quiet minutes taking a look at first your assigned plan. If you finish with that, then you can move on to any of the other plans in the link that Lee just shared in the chat box. Any questions?
Do we type the name of our plan at the top of the Jamboard?
No need to do that, Dr. Fenoy. I appreciate the question. It should already be in the Jamboard. So if you scroll over at the top, you'll be able to find the name of your plan. Every plan should have its own piece of chart pad or its own Jamboard. It's all in the same Jamboard. You just scroll across the top with a little arrow at the top. Kathy is showing it right now. Great question. You'll see at the top that little arrow she's clicking on right now.
I found it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Any other questions before we jump in?
Question. I found the Jamboard, but I'm not finding my link to the actual, in my case, Alexandria City Public Schools.
Yep. 2 ways you can access that, Thomas. In the chat box, Lee just put a link to a Google Drive that has all of the sample plans. So you'll find Alexandria in that Google Drive, or an email that you should have received with a link directly to your plan. Either way.
Jason, have we been shared? Because I'm in the Jamboard and I saw your sticky notes, but when we try to go to type in, I don't know if we've all been shared access to it. Can we double check that?
We'll double check that everyone has editor access. Thanks, Jamie. Much appreciated. Any other questions before we jump in? All right, so we'll give you a few minutes. If you have questions or need support, type in the chat. Also in the email that went out today, there was a email to 2 support folks, Lee and Kathy, in the school district of Palm Beach County, so they can support you with technology as well. We're making sure right now, as you see on the screen, that everyone has editor access. It shows that anyone with a link should have editor access. So hopefully that will work for you all. Thanks, everyone. And if you'll keep this on, you'll listen to kind of my voice in the queue to bring us back to do a quick view of your likes and dislikes across these plans. We'll spend about 10 minutes on this right now. if you'll please take just about 1 more minute to wrap up your review. Looks like we've got lots of feedback on each of the plans. So in actually less than a minute, we're going to start to briefly summarize some of the feedback on each of these plans. All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to walk you through just briefly each of the Jamboards for each plan. I'll summarize quickly. I will not read every Post-it note. I'm just going to summarize some trends that are coming through for each plan. And again, this is recorded so we can kind of hear these trends. We're going to start with Alexandria City Public Schools. So what we see on the layout is the likes around color-coded goals, but on the flip side of that, the page, the layout or length specifically is seems a little hard to follow. And so we want to pay close attention to liking color-coded goals, but overall layout seems a little hard to follow. The content, the concept of a dedicated page to racial equity and definitions, the story on pages 2 through 5 gives us a window into their belief system. It explicitly states that we're allocating resources to the highest need schools, and this concept of a theory of action seems to be appreciated. Wanting more around target and values, not liking kind of that there aren't target values assigned to each measure or KPI, maybe too many strategies or buzzwords. Let's move on to the next one. The next one we see in Boston Public Schools. On the layout side, that there are some aspects of layouts that were easy to understand. Page 26 specifically, kind of breaking up some content to make it easier to follow and more beneficial. And having kind of very tactical initiatives seemed to be something that was appreciated. But overall, the layout of this plan seemed like it was very long and hard to follow, few charts. On the content side, liking the natural graphics, the review up front of the plan that was built in, and this concept of equity as well that was listed in the plan, and how the committee task force mentions opportunity, achievements, English language learners, and how inclusive the task force was. On the side that we don't like in terms of content, just a lot of content here. So overall, too long, hard to kind of read. And again, I want to be clear that this is not an indictment on any of these organizations or school districts. This is about sort of a document. And so please don't misunderstand or mistake kind of the point of this. Each of these folks have just different theories of action for what a strategic plan should be. But it's important that we're taking time to step back and calibrate as a steering committee so that we can have sort of a common understanding of what we think the best layout and content for Palm Beach is. And so let's move on to the next one, Chicago Public Schools. On the layout side, like the graphics, pictures, diversity of the pictures, and a metrics dashboard, but also this was a very long plan. On the content side, again, the graphics seem to come through for folks. There are priorities every year, a specific quote from Dr. Sweeney. And then on the not like side, the pink sticky notes, again, it's really around length and wordiness. Too many goals, too many measures or deliverables. So we want to be cognizant of that. Moving on to number 4, District of Columbia Public Schools. Yeah, the brevity, clean graphics, likes the length, the infographic that sort of broke down their goals, the mayor's support. So the layout overall was really easy to follow. Not a lot of reds or pinks on that one. On the content side, liked how concise the mission and vision were, the equity focus, the layout again on page 5, engaging families. What we didn't like is that some goals may not be attainable. And we'll talk more about that too. So like, how do you measure students feeling loved, right? And those kinds of things. And so we'll also talk about different metrics that may not be sort of traditional things like academic achievement, and we can see a percentage of growth in reading or math achievement, but through survey data, we can get at some of these things as well. And so it's important to start to think about those aspects of measurement as well. And we'll talk about that much later. The values seem maybe a little vague. And again, just making sure that there's clarity and specificity around some of the goals themselves. All right, let's move on to number 5, Guilford County. Love the title, that there seem to be, goals not just on reading and math, but career pathways, and that they're clearly outlined. Images of students. So on what we didn't like, some of the text is too heavy. Some of this is a little bit too fluffy in terms of the words that were used. We also liked, and that kind of fits in the content side as well, the word "we" throughout, that and what that implies, that we're all part of this plan. Strong language, eradicating gaps. Research, that this is research-based, so we didn't see that in some of the others, so that's important to call out in terms of a call out. What we didn't like in terms of content, about stretch goals maybe, and commitments or targets, and seeing are they really stretch. Number 6, Miami-Dade. Little bit of confusing layout here. The just kind of catchiness of this, very wordy, not a lot of charts or graphs. On the content side, what we liked, multiple goals for parent engagement, focus on healthy and safety of students as well. And nutrition came up, liking the fact that they're transparent about strategies, and what we multiple goals again for parent engagement. As I said, what we don't like feels like a to-do list or maybe a checklist. There's a lot in it. Good content, but again, a lot there. Moving on to number 7, our last one, Joaquin.
On that Miami, Jason?
Yeah, please.
One counts because that's our local competition, and we're all jaded. So I don't know if we may have been a little hard on Miami as a team.
Totally hear you, Dr. Fenoy, on that. Now, I wanted to include at least one local plan, so we weren't accused of not looking at local plans. But but yeah, there's a flip side to every coin, isn't there? Thank you, Dr. Fenoy. I appreciate that. Waukee Community School District, cover page didn't make a statement. It just says it's a strategic plan. It seems not to be super catchy. Like the portrait of a graduate in this one. On the content side, the goal section's easy to read, so it kind of flows easily. They like the values up front, the inclusion of a variety of photos, but maybe a lack of connection between core values, portrait of a graduate. Their first priority around the core values seems to focus on team members instead of putting a strong emphasis on students and equity. Thank you for calling that out. So we get a pretty good sense here of what your likes and dislikes are. It seems like there's a lot trending towards let's keep this concise so that everyone can kind of wrap their arms around this. When we think about the implementation and utility of a strategic plan, that is incredibly critical. Let's move to the last 2 slides. If we can go back to sharing those 2 slides. We've gotten through all the plans. We have just 3 minutes left. In those 3 minutes, when you think about those plans you just looked at, which plans were particularly effective at communicating to a broad group of stakeholders and which weren't? Would love, and I think some of that is apparent and based on the feedback that we got, but want to just hear from you. Which plans were particularly, it's that second question on the second bullet point now on the slide, which plans are particularly effective at communicating to stakeholders? We've gone through the other questions and looked at what you like and don't like, layout and content. But what do you think about sort of the efficacy of communicating to stakeholders? Did one stand out to you? Dr. Fenoy, like Guilford, seemed to be a good one to communicate with stakeholders. Any other preferences, things that you have a strong preference about, plans that were effective when it comes to communicating with stakeholders? Yeah, graphics matter. Thanks, Melinda. Definitely making it accessible. Any other thoughts or feedback from that we didn't talk about? Something I may not have caught when we were walking through briefly what you liked and didn't like about layout and content that you think is important to elevate for this group?
I don't know if it was Guilford's. The one thing I've seen as I read through some of them collectively was having other members of the community in the plan. It's something about it seemed like a total community ownership. It wasn't just the school district or board members. There were people listed from all different walks. I think that it shows that it's a unified effort to meet the ultimate outcomes of this of a strategic plan. I like that a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Fenoy. And James was giving us some feedback about, teachers and educators kind of going through the narrative, donors wanting a one-page visual or dashboard. And James, with your permission, I would say not just donors, but community members writ large wanting to be able to see. And I would say even as a former teacher, I taught first grade and 11th grade. In the strategic plans in districts where I served in LA and in Nashville, where it took me a long time to actually look at their plan. I had to create a lesson plan for my kids, right? So I was more concerned about, making sure that I was aligning what was going on in my classroom. But in order to do that, I needed a summary. I needed something very clear, very concise. And so sure, not just donors, but every stakeholder, I think, being able to see that with clarity and conciseness, what the vision for this organization is, what's their North Star. So as we wrap up, I appreciate lots of comments coming through here, and I just want to be cognizant of time. Let's move on to the last two slides. Next month, we're going to talk about data and equity. In May, we're going to focus on goals, and in June, we're going to pick up goals as well. So we'll spend 2 sessions on goals. In July, we'll finalize sort of our draft recommendations for Dr. Fenoy to take to the board, and in August, we'll talk more about implementation. Next slide, last slide. So, want to get your feedback. What did you appreciate and what do you wonder about the sort of focus and flow of these meetings? We're going to be together 4 times, 5, maybe 6 times. And so would love kind of your thoughts. What do you appreciate and what do you wonder so we can make some course corrections as we engage next time. While you're thinking about that, and please list those in the chat, what you appreciate and what you wonder. A reminder of next steps. Remember to share the survey with colleagues and encourage their feedback. The phase 1 survey we talked about at the beginning of this call. Our next meeting is on April 16th. We're looking forward to engaging with you on data and equity. And the last bullet is that's our focus. We're going to do some thinking around equity root causes or inequities of or root causes of inequities. Compare that to data as we see it. What do you like and what do you wonder? We'd love to get your feedback. Liked the sample plans, seeing other plans seems to be consistent and coming through. Yep, yeah, consistently being able to see multiple plans seems to be something people liked. Thanks, Terrence. Clear and timely presentation. Yeah, chat rooms, I'd love to do that. We just have to be consistent in terms of making this open to the public. So when we go into chats, we're not able to do that. Engagement was great. Thank you. The opportunity to be interactive. I love a good Jamboard. Yeah, so will there be a SWOT or STEAM analysis in advance? We'll think about ways to engage you all in different in the different data pieces. So thanks for that feedback. We'll take that. I want to I know there's more feedback coming in. Please feel free to continue your feedback. It's 5:02. Dr. Fenoy, anything to sort of close us out?
Well, I just want to thank all of our community friends and family members who are here with us, supporting us in this endeavor. This gives me an awful lot of hope and a lot of it excites me that we're making this happen. And so I got to take a moment to thank Kathy Villavicencio. I know you've been working all spring break. You don't want any acknowledgement, but thank you, Mr. Tierney. You and your team are great. But to all of our Palm Beach County family, both in the district and outside of the district, we're going to do this and we're going to do it right. And I'm just so thankful for all of your participation. To our friends at Insights, just thank you. And if you can keep us this level of engaged throughout the next couple of months, we're going to do great things for kids here in Palm Beach County. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.